Hi everybody, so today we're going to talk about behaviorism, and kind of like the main idea of behaviorism is that it's concerned with observable and measurable conduct of humans and animals. So this is going to be purely action-based, which leads me right here. So directly observed behaviors are worthy of study, so actions, and that means that behaviorists aren't really going to care about your thoughts, your feelings, or really kind of any input you have, just because they're focusing on action, and that's going to be action in a response from a stimulus. So we have to be presented with something, and then the way we react or we come into contact with that something, whatever it is what they're going to study. And then there's also two other main ideas of behaviorism. So there's this idea that if we are rewarded for some good behavior that we do have, we're going to keep wanting to get rewarded, so we're going to keep wanting to do that behavior. And then there's also the idea that all behavior can be unlearned and replaced by new behaviors. So just because we learn something one time or we're conditioned to behave a certain way doesn't mean we're going to stay like that forever. So we're going to go into the different theorists now, but just remember that behaviorism is purely going to be action-based, so the way that you react or animals react, and it has to be in response to a stimulus. So we're going to start off with Ivan Pavlov, and he had this idea of classical conditioning, which is a learning process that occurs when two stimuluses are repeatedly paired together. And the main thing with this is going to be that repetition. So he had this experiment called Pavlov's dog's experiment, which if you've taken psychology, you probably heard about before. So he had dogs, and he trained them to behave a certain way. And he started this off their automatic and reflexive responses. So your automatic and reflexive responses are going to be ways that you react to stimuluses without even thinking about it. So it's going to be instantaneous, it's going to be involuntarily done, it's going to be spontaneous, and it's going to be purely instinct based. So this is not something that you think about acting to or acting towards. It's just going to be something that occurs below a level of conscious awareness. So once again, we're really emphasizing the unawareness of what's going on. It's done in like an unconscious level. So going back to Pavlov's dog experiment, we have a neutral stimulus, and a neutral stimulus is going to be something that doesn't have anything to do with what is going on. And then we have a unconditional stimulus, which is going to be something that results in a natural response. And then we have an unconditional response, which is what we see from that interaction from that neutral stimulus and that unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, we have a neutral stimulus of a doorbell ringing, and we paired that with an unconditional stimulus of meat powder. And when we paired those two together, we saw that unconditionally, like dogs instantaneously, automatically, without thinking, they started salivating because they smelled the meat powder. So that caused them unconsciously, unawarely to start salivating. So Pavlov saw this, and going back to this idea of classical conditioning, which is pairing two stimuluses together. So we have a neutral stimulus of the doorbell ringing, which again, a neutral stimulus is anything that doesn't provoke a response in that person, in that animal. So beforehand, these dogs had no idea what a doorbell ring, what that meant for them. But through this experiment, that neutral stimulus of a doorbell ringing became a conditional stimulus. So a conditional stimulus is going to be that previously neutral stimulus that, after becoming associated with that unconditional stimulus, eventually triggers a conditioned response. So the dog started hearing the doorbell, and then they got the meat powder, so they kind of paired those two together and well, dogs can't really talk, but they learned that when they heard the doorbell ring, they got meat powder. And when they got meat powder, they started salivating. So that neutral stimulus of the doorbell ringing became a conditional stimulus, and that unconditional response of salivating became a conditional response, because they would associate doorbell and meat powder together, which is the main idea of classical conditioning. We have two different stimuluses and we pair them together until they come into this desired response, desired action. So then the animals learned basically, they correlated the doorbell ringing with the meat powder. So then they started salivating automatically when the doorbell started ringing. And that's the idea of Pavlov's classical conditioning. So now we are going to go into Edward L. Thorndike. So Edward had this law of effect, which basically stated that if something produces a satisfying effect in a particular situation, then we are more than likely to behave that same way, so it happens again. So it's also learning from consequences of behavior. So if a behavior is followed by a positive consequence, then we're going to want to do it again. If a behavior is followed by a negative consequence, then we're not really going to do that again, which goes into his idea of reinforcement. So we are reinforced by positive behavior and we're not reinforced by negative behavior. So we learn from those consequences of behavior, hopefully. And he had this experiment of hungry cats in a box. So he got some cats, they hadn't eaten before, placed them in a box, they couldn't get out of the box. If they just sat there, it was a negative consequence because they weren't going to get any food. But there's a lever in the box. If they were able to push the lever, they were able to get out and get some food. So that positive consequence of getting food, they learned that, hey, like, if I want to get food, if I want to get out of this box, I need to push this lever. So they were conditioned to learn based off of that reinforcement, based off of that food, that they needed to press the lever to get out of the box. And next we are going to talk about B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner has a lot of information about behaviorism. So B.F. Skinner has this idea of operant conditioning, which are voluntary behaviors that, if maintained over time by the consequences that follow those behaviors. So if consequences are bad, there's a high chance that we are not going to do the action again. But if consequences are good, the probability of the action happening again becomes stronger. So he goes into this, the main idea of that there's rewards or there's punishment for certain behavior. And he showed this through an experiment that he had, a rat experimentation. And he used Skinner boxes, which were chambers designed to deliver food rewards at systematic intervals to rats, which kind of comes into positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. So the rats were stuck in a box. Obviously, they don't know what buttons, I'm not sure what rats know, but obviously in that situation, like, they didn't know how to get out of the box, they didn't know where they were at, but they learned that if they pressed a button, they would get food. So it was through this rat experimentation that Skinner was able to see that positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment has a lot to do with how people react. So we have positive and negative reinforcement, which is used to maintain or increase behavior. So positive reinforcement is giving something to a subject when they perform a desired action, so they associate the action with reward. So in the case of the rats, it was when they pushed a button, they got food, so that was positive reinforcement. And then there's also negative reinforcement, which is something uncomfortable or otherwise unpleasant is taken away to maintain or increase. So the main thing to remember with positive and negative reinforcement is that we are doing it in order to push the person, push the animal to do something. And then we also have positive and negative punishment, which is used to reduce or eliminate behavior. So for positive and negative punishment, we're always going to be taking something away. So positive punishment is presenting a negative consequence after an undesired behavior is exhibited, and we're doing this in order to reduce or eliminate a behavior. And then negative punishment is a stimulus is withdrawn or removed to eliminate a behavior. So we have to remember positive and negative punishment is going to be for eliminating, and reinforcement is going to be for increasing a behavior. They don't necessarily mean, like, negative reinforcement doesn't mean we're taking away something. Like, we can be giving the person something to reinforce it. And this leads into appetitive and aversive stimuluses. So we have appetitive stimuluses, which is a rewarding or pleasing stimulus, and an aversive stimulus, which is an unrewarding, unpleasing stimulus. So in the case of the rats, the appetitive stimulus is going to be that they got food, and the aversive stimulus is going to be that they didn't get food. So these stimuluses also go in hand with a schedule. So we have a fixed ratio schedule, which is going to be predictable. So it's going to be a stimulus that is delivered after a set number of responses. So let's say after the rats press the button 3 times, they receive a stimulus, which would be food, versus a variable ratio schedule, which is going to be the number of responses required to receive a stimulus varies, and it's going to be unpredictable. So let's say we can give the rats food after 2 presses of a button, 3 presses of a button, 4 presses of a button. It's going to change every time. The rats don't know. We don't know. It's just going to be unpredictable. And then we have a fixed interval schedule, which is a stimulus is given after a certain amount of time has passed. So let's say after 2 hours, we give the rats food. Doesn't matter how many times we press the button, we just have to wait 2 hours. And then we have a variable interval schedule, which is varying and unpredictable times. So it could be a stimulus that is given after a certain amount of time, but it's going to be kind of really random. So it doesn't matter the time, doesn't matter how many times you press a button. It's kind of like whenever I decide, like, hey, I think the rat deserves some food right now, we're going to give it some food. So that is all I have for you guys about behaviorism. So once again, just the main idea of behaviorism is that it's going to be purely action-based. It's going to be in response to a stimulus. And we have Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning, which is going to be 2 stimuluses that are conditioned or they are learned that they go together. So in the case of Pavlov, it was the doorbell and the meat powder. And then we have Edward L. Thorndike, which is the law of effect, which has to do with reinforcement. So if we receive something positive, we're going to keep doing it. If we're going to receive something negative, then we're going to try to change our behavior. And then we have operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner, which shows that we have rewards or punishment for behavior. So with rewards that we receive, or with behavior that we receive a reward for, we're going to want to keep getting that reward, so we're going to want to keep doing that behavior. And with behavior that we are punished for, we are going to try to change that, hopefully. And we can do that through reinforcement or punishment. And then it all depends on really the reward and the punishment. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, let me know. Hope you have a good day.